Shirin, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you.
It's a real honor to have you. Normally I don't have any paper with me when I do that podcast, but you have such a rich career that I thought I must have it in front of me because there's so many questions I want to ask you. But before we delve into your career, I wondered whether if we go back to the start, perhaps not at the start of your life, but to your childhood, do you think that your childhood experiences had an impact on the person you then became in your professional career?
Certainly. Several things. One, I had my uncle who became the first Governor General of Mauritius, who was then, when I was tiny, a magistrate and then a judge. So the legal aspect was already there. And I have another uncle who was younger and who was an attorney. So the legal part, I always knew that I wanted to be in law.
Okay.
That part. For politics, honestly, I can't say it was when I was a child. It was more when I came back to Mauritius, when I started going to court and realizing that even if you believe something very strongly, you go to court, you plead, the judge would say to me, Madam Cziffra, you were perfect, but the law is against you. So that got me, it was not political in the sense that people think, but it was
you
like I
to
said,
change things.
Yeah, I'm a defender. I'm a human rights defender. And I was very aware, not because I went through it, but I was very aware of the position of women everywhere, including in Mauritius. And I knew when I started looking at the Code Napoleon that we could not sit back, just go to court and keep losing cases and not do anything. So I said to myself, the only way to do something is to be a legislator. And it so happened, I came in Mauritius in 1974. Those were the days. I mean, we were going towards the first general election post-independence. And I think I did well to be a member of parliament, but my being there was not, I wasn't looking at what I could get out of it. I never even knew or imagined that I would get so far. I was the only woman in those days.
Really?
Well, there was Vidula Nabab Singh and myself. In 1976, there were 3 women. Vidula, myself, and Ghislaine Henry on the other side. 3 women out of 70.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. Today it's 20%, although women are more than 50%. They're not 52 anymore, but we are more than 50%, and we only represented by 20% women in politics. So I think that everything I went through, basically my family, we were all in justice. We were all law and justice. Even my father, who was just a civil servant, but the values that we could get from him were all, if you owe something to someone, you must reimburse. You must always be just. These were the kinds of values. So I suppose that it had a lot of impact on me.
Let's get into before you got elected as a first minister for women and also the first AG in Mauritius. Before that, though, you had to fight a couple of battles. I think, it takes courage. I don't have any other word for it. It takes courage to take on the Mauritian government and take it to the UN Human Rights Commission. So what drove you to do that, other than this strong sense of injustice?
I was myself directly a victim. I married a Frenchman. I believe in love as well. We're going to celebrate our 50 years next year.
That's wonderful.
So really, we're so proud of having gone through the bad days, and it made us become even closer and even more aware that things can change one way or the other. And we were young also. When you're young, you just arrive in a country like Mauritius, and you are in that period where you know that things will have to change anyway. Either you're part of it, or you just sit and criticize, or you don't even
do nothing.
Or do nothing. I've never been like do nothing. Even now, I'm not in politics anymore. That is very clear now, because people keep stopping me when I walk, especially in Rose Hill. I live in my former constituency.
Do they think you still are, or?
Oh no, they want me to come back.
Oh.
Because in Rose Hill, of course, we had a great impact, not only for politics in the sense that Mauritians like politics like football. No, because I was also not just a member of parliament, but I was also a municipal councillor and mayor. And we worked in our own constituency, but it was also for Beaubassin. I was member for Rose Hill, but it was Beaubassin Rose Hill. And there was so much change. We did so many fantastic things. Like, people don't know that. When I started, I had to walk on streets that were not tarred. There were places in Rose Hill where the drivers, taxi drivers, would not go beyond the Huguenin street because of the very
roads were
bad reputation.
Oh, really?
Bad reputation because of drugs, because of...
Even then?
Then, of course. Drugs has always been. It's getting big now, big money now, but drugs has always been. So they wouldn't go further. People had to walk. And also because the streets were so bad and there were no lights, nothing. So we started putting so many lights that young people would say, we can't sit and do little things to our girlfriends anymore in the streets because there's light everywhere. So we were very proud, and I think that's what members of parliament should be for. I think their first and foremost
is to their constituents.
Should be towards their constituents and the country as a whole, but to improve things. I'm not saying it's not happening now. I'm very happy about the houses coming up now, social housing.
Yes.
Because even now, I'm very much aware of the categories of people in my country. It's such a fantastic country. It's so beautiful. And we have all these people saying Mauritius is first in good governance, Mauritius is first
ease of doing business and all of that.
Exactly. We are first on lots of things, not on gender. The gender statistics are not very good. But we all know that we have some areas in Mauritius and some people who are still really very much down the ladder. Government does loads of things. Like right now, last budget, one thing we've been fighting for so long, children of poor people never used to go to pre-primary.
Yes.
Because it was paid. And also because the families cannot afford to pay, even when you tell them like crèche, even for crèche, they say, we give you free crèche, but they can't pay for transport to get the children to the crèche. So it's not sort of holistic. So now government is doing quite a few things, which I appreciate, and I write about it in the papers. I appreciate, for example, that they're giving 15,000 rupees to unemployed women who are just now starting again.
To get back into
for 2 years.
Workforce. Yeah.
And I said to the Prime Minister, that's a very good thing. And I said, but it'll stop after 2 years. He said to me, but we want to convince the companies to keep these people. We have to make sure that this can happen. Otherwise, they stay there for 2 years and then they go back.
Yeah, back into unemployment.
Unemployment.
Yeah. But going back to that famous case, so as you said, you were personally a victim, and just for those of our audience who are not familiar, it all turned around one word, effectively.
It was just one word. It was about immigration. Before, when I got married to Claude, who is also well known, because Claude worked for radio and Full Express. Now he walks in the streets, everybody says hello, But in those days, they passed the amended Immigration and Deportation Acts so that male husbands of Mauritian women would not get automatically the status of resident which we had before. The law was so bad that it applied to people who were already married and who already had status.
And who were already living here.
We were living here.
Yeah, and participating in the community.
That was the very thing. We were participating, maybe I was participating too much, because when I came, my first thing was women. Of course, my big thing was workers. And I was one with Aumeeruddy-Cziffra and Kader Bayat. I was more or less the third because some other people had gone. I was the third lawyer to defend workers. I was defending workers from the bus industry, sugar industry, the tea industry, dockers, everyone. Because the GWF, General Workers' Federation, was very close to the MMM in those days. And we were defending workers. So defending workers and defending women, that was, of course, a great majority. And I suppose there were, I see with time, there must have been in those days different approaches to different members of parliament, because some of them just crossed the floor.
I see.
You know, in those days,
yeah.
they crossed the floor. And I would never have crossed the floor, so they had to look for something else. My something else was I had married a French husband. And it is a sort of racial thing as well. Because, you know, you said I was the first minister. I was not. The first minister was somebody I admire, was Mrs. Punusami. Okay. You know, she was not Mauritian. Mrs. Punusami was a member of the ANC from South Africa.
I did not know that.
Can you imagine our first woman minister was not a Mauritian born? So what? She married Dr. Punusami, and she was somebody who was very interesting and very nice. She was not for a long time. It was just at one point somebody died, and because of the best loser system, she was next on the list. And Chacha, Dr. Navin Ramgoolam, not Navin's father, then realized that it was the year of women, 1975. So he made her Ministre de la Condition Féminine and Price and Consumer Protection. It's very interesting because we just had the fourth minister right now, Doreen Chakri. She's also minister looking after commerce, price and consumer protection. So like women are seen to be people who are very aware
of what's going on among consumers.
Exactly. Of course, because we go shopping.
Yeah.
Men also go shopping.
Well, I hope so. I hope more men are going shopping.
Oh yes. But we know what it costs to feed our kids. So now we have a new minister, which is a good thing. We've got 4. We used to have 3, now we have 4. But that's nothing. 4 out of 24 ministers.
Yeah. 1/6.
Yeah.
So then you went to the UN. I understand they gave a quite stern ruling, and then in a couple of years later, in 1983, you became the first. Am I right? The first woman.
I was the first, and I'm the only woman Attorney General of Mauritius up to now. I'm the only one. I became first Minister of Justice, Attorney General. That's the real term, is Attorney General. We entered the case before the United Nations in 1978. The law was passed in 77, so by the time we made all our papers and everything, it was 78. It took us some
3
time.
years. I believe in 81 they gave
In 81 they gave the
3
judgment.
years later.
And so we were right in the middle of the next elections. We were going to do the 1982 elections, famous one.
Yes.
And
The
nothing
60-0 one.
changed. Yes, but nothing changed in the meantime. So when we won, I became Attorney General. Of course, was not the first law I changed. I had lots of other things on my plate, like
sure.
making sure that we would never, that's one of the things I'm proud of. Of course, it was the government, not just Shirin, but I was the one who was working on amending the constitution so that we would never, ever postpone general elections. So now if you want to postpone general elections, it's like locked, more or less.
I did not know that, actually.
It is locked. You cannot do it. Normally, the constitution
Allows you to... Before that, what was the position? You could postpone?
You could there was nothing. There was nothing which prevented you from. But normally you change the constitution, you need 3/4 of a majority. We put that to change that one, that piece that we entered there, you needed 4/4, you needed unanimity. And also it could only be done if there was something like war or something very, very bad.
Yeah.
And we even introduced a concept, but it has never been worked on properly, the concept of consultation of the whole population.
I see. It's sort of a referendum.
Referendum.
Yeah.
The word is there.
Yeah.
But we don't have referendums in Mauritius yet.
Do you think that would be a good thing or bad thing? I mean, we all know what's happened with Brexit. Do you think that would have been or would be a good thing if we had that concept?
You can't tell, because even in France, with referendums have given funny kinds of results.
Yes.
Yeah. But the idea is not so bad. On certain issues, it could have been interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
So would you say that particular measure that you mentioned, that was the proudest measure that you helped implement?
I think for me, it's the thing that I liked most. There were lots and lots of things that we did in 9 months, but we only stayed 9 months. And my deepest regret, of course, is that we were perhaps too young. I was only 33.
That's young.
Yes. Anil Jagnat was the only one who was not as young as we were. Most of us, we were in our 30s. Most of us. Béranger was 36.
Wow.
So
very idealistic, perhaps.
Very idealistic. Yeah. Things happen in a way which is difficult to explain now to people. I think we should have stayed, but at that particular time, it wasn't working the way we thought.
True.
Anyway, we stayed 9 months, but when I look back, in the 9 months, we did quite a lot. You know, it's like creating the Ministry of Gender. It's called Gender now. I created that ministry from scratch. Because there
was nothing before.
Madame Poudou-Samy, they made her Minister of Condition de la Femme, Condition Féminine.
Right.
She told me, she said, I never had time to do anything. I was running after the inflation.
The consumer bit, yeah.
Okay, so, and she didn't even have a ministry proper. So what we did was, at the time when I was just a member of parliament, I was already shadow minister. We had a few shadow ministers. I was already shadow minister for women. I was working on women's issues for the 5 years. And we were, preparing ourselves. And in that time, also in the world, things were moving, because the United Nations, we already had 75, the Year of Women. And you know what happened? The UN has all sorts of years. But the women all over the world said 1 year is not enough for you to change the women's condition in the world.
I agree.
Of course, some countries are worse than others. But even the women working inside the UN, in the different organs of the UN, they pushed, and finally we had a first decade, we had a second decade, and finally we had 4 decades, and we went to Beijing. That's when things were really happening. So when I was minister, created that ministry, few people could understand what it was.
What exactly do you do?
Yes. And men perhaps also felt, what's this? Why do they need a ministry for women? That's presumably why now they've moved to gender. The whole world is talking of gender. It's a bit complex, huh?
It's not an easy...
It's not easy.
Issue, yeah.
It's a very important term, but it's not easy, because if you talk, for example, of gender-based violence, which is something which is happening all the time in Mauritius and elsewhere.
Yes.
you get the impression that it could be a man or a woman or somebody LGBT, etc. But we all know that statistics show that it is
99%
mostly
of cases,
women.
of course.
And even if a man is, I've defended men who've been beaten. You know, they're beaten like avec une savate, or avec un balai, or mostly women they don't use violence physically.
It's verbal, emotional abuse.
A lot of emotional, verbal abuse. So we are not, sometimes people don't understand how can you be a feminist. Like one of our colleagues said very loudly the other day, Shirin is a feminist, but she also defends men in court. Of course I defend men.
One is not mutually exclusive to the other.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And also when you defend a cause, you're not talking about one single person. It's the same if you are anti-racist. It's not because you're anti-racist that every person who's not white is an angel. So I can take anybody's case to court, a man or a woman. So happens I have many men who come to see me and they also go through hell. Because if I do family law, some people won't do family law because it's too hard.
It is hard. I was just asking that last week we had a doctor on the podcast and I was asking him how he remains emotionally detached and he said it's impossible. And I compared it to someone who practices family law. How do you not get emotionally drawn in? How do you find that balance? It's hard. I think it's one of the hardest with criminal law perhaps as well.
Yeah, I do a bit of criminal law, but not that much. We do get a little bit involved, but I have learned, and you know when I learned this more, remember I was ombudsperson for children.
Yes.
In those days when I was ombudsperson for children, Kofi Annan asked me to sit on an editorial board on violence against children. Yes. When I went there, every 2 months, I was going to Geneva, paid by the UN. And there I met some fantastic people who were really experts in the issue of violence, including people from the WHO. Because WHO did work a lot on the issue of violence, even against women, violence in general. Sure. So I learned quite a lot from them. And I learned that you have to not be too close. You cannot, and I had to teach that to my team because I set up the Ombudsperson for Children. I've been lucky. I set up the ministry now. I set up Ombudsperson for Children. And I wanted that, and I had, really worked on that as well. So I taught to my team, and they understood that when somebody comes, a parent comes with a child, you don't start crying. You don't start getting so involved that in the end you're yourself the victim.
Or it could cloud your judgment.
It could cloud your judgment, but you're also stealing from that other person the grief.
I see.
You have to keep aloof. They have a grief. What I go through difficult moments because sometimes you can't treat people who go to the family court, whether man or woman, you can't treat them the same way that you will treat an ordinary civil case. Because it is so emotional. And sometimes they get very angry. Those who don't see their kids, for example, they get so angry. And you can tell them, if you're angry, it won't help you in court. But you must understand.
It's easier said than done, though.
Exactly. It's easier said than done. So you need a lot of patience when you go to the family court. And the family judges also need that patience. And they also need to understand that people who come in, they're just not robots. They're going through difficult moments, and we must understand. So I learned all these things like, don't take the place of that person who's a victim. Because otherwise you're not going to be as good.
Yes.
You're the one who have to keep...
Yes. A cool head.
A cool head.
Yeah.
So that's what I try to do.
Yeah. That's amazing. I'd like to think of myself as a feminist as well. People always tease me that I have a unconscious bias against men because there's only one man in our team. But that's beside the point. I was going to ask you, what do you think a feminist looks like in 2023 when you compare your passions and all the fights that you had in the 80s and when you look at today? We've obviously come a long way, but do you think there's still a lot of work to be done in other areas?
Of course. Well, today we're talking more about sexual violence, about sexual harassment at work. Of course, there was the Me Too.
Yes.
Which was a bit annoying because it put forward the Hollywood people. But they are going through difficult times as well. So in a way, it was good for them to cry out, speak out, so that other women can take, if they can speak out,
then
why can't
can
I?
Too. Yeah.
I can. So now we're turning down on the Hollywood side and we are looking at the issues of harassment. Harassment at work is happening all the time. But do you know that in Mauritius we have an Equal Opportunity Commission which has to deal with harassment, including making policies and making companies understand what it's all about. Equality, inclusion, harassment, all these very important issues. When I talk to them, I ask them, how many cases of harassment have you had? Because I wrote that book, Femmes de l'ombre à la lumière, and I wanted to speak about this.
To have the statistic to be able to.
They said, women don't come.
They're scared.
They're scared. They don't come. And somebody one day said to me, but you know, women also pousse beau, they said in Creole. Of course, we know that there's promotion canapé. We know that some women will use their charm.
Yes, to get that promotion.
In order to get that promotion. But then all this should not be happening in the work environment. And today, I was reading about the National Corporate Governance
Code
Committee.
Yeah, okay.
They are talking more and more about equity, inclusion, and they deal with companies. We have laws. The Workers' Rights Act is not so bad. I'd say on that issue, Mauritius was one of the first to include these issues very clearly in the law, even before the Convention 190 of the ILO came out.
The issue is more the implementation though, isn't it?
That is the problem. So how I go sometimes to speak to people in companies or elsewhere. I used to go to schools when I was ombuds. Some companies, banks, have in their team somebody who's in charge of making sure that we have diversity, that somebody is also available to listen to anybody, man or woman, who wants to come and talk about what's happening. And then they even have a team of psychologists who can be called anytime in case they need that kind of help. Most people would prefer to see a psychologist rather than go and fight the case.
Of course. But the problem I feel remains that you've mentioned banks. All well and good for big conglomerates and big banks and big companies. But I think when you look at the kind of the smaller companies, the SMEs or smaller workplaces, I agree with you. I think there is still this fear of, what if I lose my job? What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm the one who attracted it? And then, we've seen positive changes such as, in this year's Finance Act, in listed companies, 25% have to be, I think they didn't for
those who are big
yes,
ones.
Exactly. So yes, there are baby steps, but do you think we're doing enough? Or we can never do enough, I guess, is going to be the answer.
We should never say that we do enough, because I'm an idealist. I'm always putting the target very high. And of course, we have to keep working. We know it takes time.
Yes.
And we know it's a world problem. You know, I mean, when I was in London doing my studies in the 70s, I started, then it was racking in my brains about feminism, came more or less then. Can you imagine when I went to Paris? It was even fantastic.
Yeah, amazing.
When you start thinking of the MLF in Paris, you start reading Le Deuxième Sexe, then you say, oh my God, this is all happening. But it has happened even before that. So it's when you start, as a young person, you start getting interested in all these issues. I'm saying, if I can, through you, I would like all young people, men, girls and boys, men and women, we would like them to contribute in some kind of way, wherever they are. Either they are in a company, in a SME, or they are even in government. If they are in parliament, it's even better. Wherever they are, each person, I think, can bring something positive.
I agree.
So I am a little bit annoyed when I hear people, sort of, this is not good, this is not good, this is...
Just criticizing.
So easy to say it's not good.
What are you doing about it?
What are you doing about it? When I wrote in L'Express a series on women's rights or human rights, and in that series I also spoken of governance. I think that governance, of course, the authorities are first, top the list. You also have the others, companies, private sector, but you also have citizens.
Yes, each one of us.
Each citizen must play his role. And even as an ombudsperson, I used to go to school and I used to talk to the children, and I wish we would do more in schools about teaching children the good values.
Yes, civisme.
Civisme.
Yes.
We don't,
which I don't think we do, actually.
No, but in Lycée La Bourdonnais and Lycée Mascareignes,
in the private
they
schools,
are doing it. My children used to bring books at home on civisme. We keep talking about this. There has been a lot of improvement in the education sector, but on that issue, it's still not working well. Because who's going to teach? That's the whole point. The teacher who is already doing quite a lot doesn't have time. He may not be the person to do that. So what happens is that the ombudsperson goes there, the National Human Rights Commission goes there, but it's like bits and pieces. There is no such thing, whereas it's easy to do it. You can choose a subject in which you can introduce history. You can do it in other subjects, even in when you're teaching kids to prepare for GP. What do they learn for GP? How do they do? My GP was all about democracy.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So we want them to be equipped, and we want them to do something about it, not just say we are a democratic country. To be a democratic country, we have to have this culture of democracy.
Yes.
When I watch the news and I see what's happening in some countries with women, it's really heartbreaking. It's not happening in Mauritius, but we can improve.
And I feel it's also a change of mindset as well. I always, whenever I'm asked questions about the gender issue, particularly women on boards and those kind of issues, I always say that it starts in the home. I always say that. Why? Because I feel like, particularly in Mauritius, maybe it's a cultural issue as well, that it's all well and good to aspire to have women have an equitable role at work, but if they don't have an equitable role at home and they're still expected to be the subservient woman who, have to serve everyone and everything, it's physically impossible in 24 hours in a day, 8 of which you're sleeping, to do all that. So it's a change of mindset as well.
To come back to what you were saying about family law, we find often when we're drafting petitions for divorce that men will keep on saying, even if you're a very qualified woman, even if you have a good job and you're earning more than he is, which may be a problem for him, he will say, but when you come home, you stop. You are my wife. You have to look after the kids.
That's great. That's great.
I was a member of parliament. At times I was a practicing lawyer and a member of parliament and a councillor and mayor. I was maire ME and MAIRE. Of course, I suppose my kids felt that mum was not at home so much. You know what I used to do? I would take them. I would take my son and take him to the football because I had to go to the football. And he loved football until now. He would go and put the medaille.
Oh.
You know, I would take my daughter, who's, amongst other things, she's a psychoanalyst and she's an artist. I would take them to the Galerie Max Boulet. So I would take them to the theatre. The plaza was a theatre in those days. I tried to get them involved in what I'm doing, but it is true that in terms of time at home, maybe I wasn't at home so much.
But you probably had a very supportive husband as well.
Well, the husband, so happens, didn't do anything because he was not allowed to.
Of course.
So he was mother and father at the same time. So, but even then, you do need to have a supportive husband. And government gave the 5 days paternity leave. Some men are taking their paternity leave. Maybe we'll reach a point where we say parental leave.
Yeah.
So the one who is able to take time off will actually take time off to look after the kids. Yeah. This is very common. You know, when you go to Europe mostly, you find so many men walking around with babies. You know, it's amazing.
Yes.
They carry the babies. That doesn't stop them looking at their phone sometimes. They take them to the kindergarten,
to the park,
etc. You know, one of the important conferences that the UN did was in Scandinavia, in Denmark.
Okay.
When we were there, Copenhagen, we realized that the whole town was organized for kids. Oh. There were small kindergartens every corner of big streets. And if you go in a bus with children, never the bus will start until you're seated properly. You know, little things like that. So it's a whole culture.
Yes, it is a cultural thing.
Culture.
Yeah, I remember when my mum went to Australia at the beginning of the year, and the first thing she said when she came back, she said, it's amazing, I went in a bus and the driver waited until I sat down to drive. But anyway.
That sounds like a small thing.
Yes, but it makes a huge difference.
It means that it is ingrained.
Yes.
So when are we going to be able to change things to such an extent that people won't see women as second-class citizens? Although, you know, that we manage to change the constitution because of Beijing. All these things, we have to look at the international scene.
Of course.
I'm very conscious that I was able to do a lot for women in the 70s because of the UN, because of the Year of Women, because of the decades, because of the different big conferences that I went to, and that people who didn't even go knew what was going on. Because what we realized when we did that was that in every nook and corner of the planet, women are having problems. Some of them are having it now on a very large scale.
And quite violent as well.
Violent, shocking. They're in prison. They are not allowed to go to schools. They're not allowed to work.
Yes.
They're not allowed to, there's no freedom whatsoever. These are extreme cases. So we're lucky in Mauritius. We must never, I think, paint the picture so dark that everybody will say, oh my God. No, but we must be aware that it is an ongoing process and that we can bring something into it. It's the same for women, it's the same for children, but my very important point is that it should start from babies, how you bring them up. Because when I was born, Dad said that some people said to him, maybe next time you'll do better.
Because you were a girl.
Exactly. And he replied, maybe jokingly, he said, my daughter's going to be someone. And sometimes I say, maybe he told me that, and I knew that I had to be someone. But now I don't have to be. I'm
true.
okay. I don't need to prove anything.
Because it's funny you said that, because I've the number of women that I've interviewed over the past year, the vast majority of them had extremely supportive fathers. And like you said, it's the role model. If your father say, I believe in you, you're going to be someone. And obviously you made it happen. But if you were raised to feel that you were second-class citizen, maybe you wouldn't have this sense of fearlessness, as you said.
Exactly.
So on the international scene, you were quite heavily involved in international NGOs and your role at the editorial board at the UN as well. How did you see that evolution? The picture must have been quite, particularly when you're dealing with Africa, quite
very difficult.
Difficult, yeah.
Yeah, I dealt with Africa in NGOs in the times when we had Nairobi conference. When we had the Nairobi conference, then we decided to do something for Africa. Then Women in Law and Development Africa, WILDAF, very well known. And then later, I was also involved with Femmes Afrique Solidarité, which is more difficult because it was trying to get women on the table after there had been a conflict within the country.
I see.
So once the conflict was over, we said to ourselves, men are the ones who go in the conflict. They're the ones who fight. They're the ones who die. And our sons die.
Yeah.
So once it's finished, we don't think that men should be the only one at the peace table. We think women should also be at the peace table. So we set up that Femmes Afrique Solidarité, which has been working in several countries, but it is so hard. It's very hard.
I mean, in some countries, they still have, I remember, it was fiction, but I was talking to our podcast guest last week, and I think it was for our school certificate, we studied The River Between, which is an African novel about female circumcision. And it still happens in some countries.
It still happens. When we went to Nairobi, the women there said to us, you can't talk about this because you don't know anything about it. But in Beijing, so many years later, they started talking openly, and lots of countries have made it illegal. But once more, it can be illegal, but in some places,
villages and remote areas,
yes, it's still happening. So yes, that is something, luckily, that we don't have in Mauritius.
And what inspired you to, so you wrote, I haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet, but I will do. So last year you published a book on women, and what inspired you to put pen to paper?
All this time I've been so active. I kept saying to myself, one day I will have to write everything, not about my story, I can still do that if I want, if I have time, but about what happened to women in Mauritius. So the book is called Femmes de l'ombre à la lumière. It is about the evolution of the rights of women in Mauritius. So I have, of course, there's a lot of law in it. It's very important. I talk about all the treaties that Mauritius signs, the conventions, and covenants and all that. And then I analyze the law, the Code Napoleon, to show what it was. Code Napoleon in 1804, women couldn't do anything. Like if a woman wanted to sue her husband for alimony, she had to ask for his permission to sue him. You see how ridiculous it could be. And she couldn't work if he didn't like her to work in that particular place. And he could go and get her salary at the end of the month.
Wow.
So, these are only a few
examples.
Yeah. So now, young lawyers in my firm, I have to teach them that. So I go to the IGLS to do some training of lawyers, the Institute for Judicial and Legal Training. And I speak about these things to remind them where we were at the beginning of the century with the French, first of all, with Napoleon, and then how things changed gradually, and where we are now in terms of rights. And as I said, you know, the word sex discrimination, the term was not in our constitution until 1995. And it was because of the Beijing conference. Even I couldn't change it when I was minister, because there was so much fear. What would these people think? What would this community think, etc.? I didn't manage to convince everybody to change that.
Wow.
But we went on with lots of other women. This is very important. We want NGOs. Because when I was minister, I would not have been able to do lots of things if there were not the NGOs outside supporting me.
Yeah.
So being the only woman Attorney General and minister was bad, but at least I had the women outside.
The support of the,
And you know, when women are strong, in those days it was 52%. So any government would say, if women start voting against us, we've had it.
We're dead. Yeah.
We're dead. So NGOs must be active. There are some very good NGOs, but on the women's front, on the gender front, I don't feel the same thing that I felt in the 70s.
Perhaps, but I don't know, maybe it's because, as you said, the evolution of it, we've come so far. Now we're talking about more subtle forms of discrimination. Maybe they are more passionate about other issues.
There are the ones who are dealing with gender violence. You have SOS, FAM, and you have gender
links.
Gender links.
Yeah.
Yes? These two are very good. Gender links is doing quite a lot of work apart from domestic violence. They're doing quite a lot of work on parity. So there are, but I would love to see what we had, that solidarity.
Yes, yeah.
So we tried,
Yes.
Even I and a few friends, we tried to set up something. It's still working. We don't know what it's going to become, because women are also working, so they don't have so much time to give to struggles.
Yes.
But
yes,
somehow,
perhaps before they weren't working, or because of their status in society, they had
could
more
do it.
Yeah, exactly. They had more time.
But we will have to find ways and means of keeping them active and thinking.
Yes.
So people, even if we don't struggle the same way we used to do, that's why I write in the papers. I'm not very good with the social media. Some of my friends are very good and they're writing on social media. I write in the newspapers and it gets online.
But Mauritians read newspapers. It's still a very, very popular form of, educating and just last question for you, Shirin. We have a lot of young people watching us, young women, young professionals in their 20s. What piece of advice would you have, or wisdom would you have for them as they look ahead in what life has in store for them?
I would come back to this ombre à la lumière. Okay. I think what women need is believing in themselves, having more self-confidence. That's what we need. Because if you have self-confidence, then you can go very far. And you shouldn't let other people tell you you're this way or that way. What is more important is what you think of yourself, and how much you can contribute. And everybody doesn't have to contribute like I did. Yes. They can contribute in their own way, in their own environment. There's always something one can do. So I would say to women, move from that ombre. No need to come in the extreme light.
Yes.
But come forward. Believe in yourselves. I think that's very important.
Thank you, Shirin. You are a role model for women and men in this country. I wish you an early happy birthday, because I know it's a special date for you in October. Keep doing what you're doing.